Hashtag the Carolinas Housing Road Trip. What the 2026 data actually shows, you've seen the headlines. Carolinas Housing Crash 2026. We drove 10 cities and pulled the real numbers, and 9 out of 10 of them tell a completely different story. We drove the data, not just the highways, across 10 cities in North and South Carolina to see what's actually happening in 2026. Some of what we found matches the doom and gloom story you've heard. Most of it doesn't. Statewide, both Carolinas are being described by their own realtor associations as stabilizing and normalizing, not crashing. Modest price growth, rising inventory giving buyers real leverage, and mortgage rates easing into the low 6% range. North Carolina's median sale price sits around $378,000 to $383,000, up roughly 2% to 2.5% year over year, with inventory up 9 to 11%. South Carolina's overall median runs near $340,000 to $352,000, similarly up 1.5 to 1.7%, with sales volume actually rising 5% year over year. That's a very different story than a collapse. Let's go city by city and see where the real pressure actually is and where it isn't. Number 10. Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Myrtle Beach's entire identity rests on tourism and vacation home demand, hotels, mini golf courses, and endless rows of oceanfront condos lining Ocean Boulevard, which makes it a natural target for any the party's over narrative about coastal real estate. Myrtle Beach might be the single most contradictory data set on this entire trip. One tracker shows the median sale price down 5.09% year over year, with homes sitting 85 days and a 6.27-month supply. Another shows it up 10.5% year over year in the same window, even as price per square foot fell 8.1%. A third puts the citywide median even lower, closer to $239,000. While single-family homes specifically run $328,000 to $385,000, and new construction spans an even wider $270,000 to $660,000 range. Here's the pattern interrupt. Those numbers aren't actually contradicting each other so much as describing completely different segments of the same market. Condos and smaller units are pulling the overall median down even as single-family homes hold their value. Which means a single Myrtle Beach is crashing headline is really averaging together two very different housing markets that happen to share a zip code. Roughly 79% of Myrtle Beach listings now carry a price reduction, up from 74% a year earlier, a real sign of softening seller leverage. But the market is still only described as relatively balanced, with more selection for buyers rather than panic among sellers. Number 9. Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston's cobblestone streets and historic mansions have long made it the crown jewel of low-country real estate, the kind of market that seemed immune to national slowdowns for years. That reputation is exactly why any sign of softening here gets amplified into a bigger story than the data actually supports. Charleston's insurance and affordability pressures are genuinely real, and the second home market has cooled from its 2021-2022 peak as higher rates on vacation properties bite harder than on primary residences. Charleston also carries the highest median home price of any city on this list at $622,000 to $710,000, well above the South Carolina statewide median, and its median days on market of 67 remains faster than the state average, still favoring sellers. But the 2026 data tells a calmer story than a crisis. Median prices have stabilized in the $680,000 to $710,000 range, with inventory up roughly 14%, described by local brokerages as a welcome sense of stability after years of volatility. Here's the pattern interrupt. Rising inventory in a historically undersupplied market like Charleston is being treated by local agents as a genuinely healthy correction. Not a warning sign. More choices for buyers after years of bidding wars isn't the same story as a market in free fall, even if insurance costs remain a real and separate burden for anyone budgeting a purchase. Rental affordability pressure is real here too, but that's described by regional analysts as a supply and demand issue tied to Charleston's continued popularity, not evidence that people have stopped wanting to live there. Number 8. Charlotte, North Carolina. Charlotte built its reputation as the banking capital of the South, and its uptown skyline of construction cranes has become shorthand in a lot of these videos for reckless overbuilding rather than ordinary growth. Charlotte's rental oversupply is real, and thousands of new apartment units genuinely are softening the rental market the way the original story described. Active listings statewide show Charlotte with the highest count of any North Carolina metro, over 3,400, but that reflects its status as the state's largest market by population, not necessarily distress. The sales data tells a different story. Charlotte's median home price sits at $415,000 to $435,000 in 2026, and Zillow projects it to rise too. 8% through the year, even as inventory climbs 19% and days on market stretch past 71. Here's the pattern interrupt. Rising inventory alongside rising prices is not the supply glut collapse scenario it's often framed, as it's what a market recovering from years of severe undersupply typically looks like on its way back to balance. And Charlotte and Raleigh are explicitly named by regional analysts as the state's strongest appreciation markets in 2026, described as driven by strong fundamentals rather than speculative spikes, not its weakest. Institutional single-family rental buyers have genuinely pulled back their pace of acquisitions in Charlotte compared to the peak boom years. But that's described by market analysts as a natural cooling of an unusually aggressive buying spree, not as a sign those same investors are now rushing to dump properties at a loss. Number 7. Raleigh, North Carolina. Raleigh became the poster child of pandemic-era tech migration. Apple and Google both expanding into the area. And that hype is exactly what made it such an easy target for the bubble has to pop here prediction. Raleigh is genuinely the most contested data point on this list, and depending on which tracker you check, you'll come away with a completely different impression. Redfin's 3-month reading through May 2026 shows prices down 2.4% to 8% year over year, at a median around $425,000, with days on market up slightly to 34. But the same period shows sales volume up 7.2%, the metro's largest year-over-year sales increase of the year, with 1,510 homes sold in May versus 442 a year earlier, and Zillow separately projects 1.4% growth for 2026, while Homes.com pegs April price growth at a modest but positive 0.3%. Here's the pattern interrupt. Raleigh was the fastest-growing major U.S. market for population from 2024 to 2025. And inventory rising 20% alongside sales volume also rising is a sign of a market absorbing new supply successfully, not one where buyers have vanished. A genuine bubble deflating looks like falling prices and falling sales together. And Raleigh's sales are moving in the opposite direction. Even Raleigh's condo segment posted a striking 30.8% price gain, while single-family homes dipped just under 2%, underscoring how much a single citywide median can hide. Washington, D.C. Homebuyers surged to move into Raleigh more than any other metro in recent migration data, followed by New York and Charlotte. A demand signal that looks nothing like a market people are fleeing. Number 6. Greensboro, North Carolina. Greensboro reinvented itself from a manufacturing and logistics hub into a mid-sized market that rarely gets the same national attention as Charlotte or Raleigh, which is exactly why a single soft data point about its luxury segment can get inflated into a much bigger story than the broader numbers support. Greensboro was one of 5 North Carolina metros specifically flagged by regional data as exceeding both state and national appreciation rates in 2026, alongside Winston-Salem, Rocky Mount, Jacksonville, and Pinehurst, not one of the state's weak spots. Median prices here run around $260,000 to $285,000, among the most affordable in the state, with homes selling in a brisk 56 days. And 673 active listings averaging $439,014 by one broader count. Here's the pattern interrupt. Greensboro's luxury segment genuinely has softened. Homes over $500,000 are sitting longer as that specific buyer pool has shrunk. But that's a narrow upper-tier story. not evidence that the broader market, where most Greensboro transactions actually happen at far more modest price points, is falling apart the way a single luxury homes or struggling data point might be extrapolated to suggest. Greensboro's logistics and manufacturing base has also continued adding warehouse and distribution jobs, giving the local economy a steadier floor than a single residential statistic could ever capture on its own. Canceled listings, a real phenomenon anywhere sellers test optimistic pricing, are a normal feature of a market shifting from frenzy to balance, and treating every withdrawn listing as evidence of panic ignores how routine that behavior actually is in a cooling but still functional market. Worth pausing here, 5 stops into this road trip, notice how consistently the pattern repeats. Rising inventory shows up almost everywhere on this list, but rising prices show up right alongside it in most of these cities too. That combination isn't what a housing crash looks like, it's what a market finally shaking off years of pandemic-era scarcity looks like, and the difference matters enormously for anyone actually deciding whether to buy here. Number 5. Columbia, South Carolina. Columbia is one of the clearest examples on this whole trip of a real reversal from the doom narrative. Zillow shows Columbia's average home value up 3.8% year over year in 2026. Or 1.4% by an earlier reading, with inventory up nearly 9%, giving buyers more selection without prices actually falling. Fort Jackson. The University of South Carolina and Prisma Health are explicitly credited by local analysts with creating stable, recession-resistant demand, and Columbia's median sale price runs roughly 41% below the national average, an affordability edge that's held even as inventory has grown. Here's the pattern interrupt. A market anchored by a major military base, a large public university, and a regional hospital system is structurally different from an investor-driven boomtown, and Columbia's steady, unspectacular appreciation in 2026 is exactly what that kind of institutionally anchored demand base is supposed to produce, not a warning sign of hidden distress. One narrower reading did show a specific segment of the Columbia market down 1% in late 2025, a reminder that even a genuinely appreciating metro can contain individual submarkets moving the opposite direction. That kind of internal variation is normal in any metro this size, and it's exactly why a single citywide statistic, whichever direction it points, should never be treated as the whole story for every neighborhood inside it. Number 4. Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Winston-Salem's transformation from a tobacco industry town into a hub for healthcare and technology gives it a real economic story worth telling. But that reinvention narrative rarely makes it into videos looking for a simpler collapse angle instead. Winston-Salem was specifically named among the North Carolina metros, posting appreciation above both the state and national average in 2026. A direct contradiction of the idea that its affordable alternative status has collapsed. Every price tier here runs 14 to 34% below national averages, with a median household income of $72,337 against a median home price near $380,000. And Forsyth County's active listings were actually down 13% year over year in early 2026, even as new listing activity accelerated 11%. Suggesting sellers testing the market are finding reasonable conditions rather than panic selling. Here's the pattern interrupt. Falling active inventory alongside rising new listings and rising pending sales, up 12.5%, describes a market where homes are moving fast enough to keep pace with new supply, which is close to the textbook definition of a healthy market. Not one buckling under mortgage application declines. Neighboring Greensboro's median days on market of 56 tells a similar story of steady, orderly activity across the whole Piedmont Triad region, not a market seizing up. The region's mortgage application data, often cited as a leading indicator of collapse, has to be read alongside actual closed sale figures and in the Triad. Closed sales and pending contracts have kept pace with new listings closely enough that the region continues to rank among the state's more affordable functioning markets rather than a cautionary tale. Number 3. Fayetteville, North Carolina. Fayetteville's identity is inseparable from Fort Liberty, and any story about military town housing markets tends to reach for the same dramatic language: families trapped, transactions frozen, without checking whether the underlying numbers actually support it. Fayetteville's economy leans heavily on Fort Liberty, and the affordability challenge for military families juggling frequent moves against 6% plus mortgage rates is a genuine, well-documented pressure that shapes the local market differently than a typical civilian metro. But Fayetteville's median price, around $312,800, remains among the most affordable major markets in the state, with 162 active listings by one regional count, and it appears in North Carolina's own price index data as a stable, if modest, market rather than one in freefall. Here's the pattern interrupt. A market built around a transient, service-driven population has always required different math than a typical civilian metro: steady turnover and rental demand instead of long-term appreciation. And that's a structural feature of military towns everywhere, not a new crisis specific to Fayetteville's 2026 housing market. Interestingly, Redfin's own migration data shows Fayetteville as one of the more popular destinations searched by Raleigh homebuyers looking for relative affordability, a sign of continued regional demand rather than a market people are actively fleeing. Veterans Affairs loan activity, sometimes cited as a distress signal when delinquencies tick up, has to be weighed against Fayetteville's genuinely large share of VA-eligible borrowers overall. A modest rise in delinquencies among a much larger loan pool doesn't automatically signal the kind of systemic financial distress a more alarming framing implies. Number 2. Spartanburg, South Carolina. Spartanburg has spent recent years rebranding itself from a historic railroad hub into an affordable alternative to its flashier neighbor Greenville, and that rebrand pitch is precisely the kind of story that gets twisted into the affordable alternative has become a trap once construction picks up. Spartanburg is projected for continued price growth between February 2025 and January 2026. According to South Carolina's own market trend data, directly contradicting the idea that its new construction boom has become an oversupply trap. Spartanburg remains one of the state's most affordable cities, with median prices consistently well under $300,000, and regional forecasts explicitly describe it as offering gradual growth and opportunities for long-term investment. Grouped alongside Greenville as part of upstate South Carolina's consistent growth story. Here's the pattern interrupt. Builder incentives and new construction competition are a normal feature of any fast-growing suburb absorbing new supply, and South Carolina's statewide foreclosure rate remains below the national average. Described by analysts as reflecting careful lending practices and economic growth, which directly undercuts the specific claim that Spartanburg homeowners are falling behind on payments at any unusual rate. Days on market statewide running 53 to 70 days is treated as a sign of buyers finally gaining negotiating room, not of a market where nobody can afford to buy. Spartanburg's continued rail and manufacturing employment base, the same historic hub city identity that gave it its name, provides an economic anchor separate from any single new construction subdivision, which is exactly the kind of diversified demand that tends to prevent the runaway builder versus builder price wars a collapse narrative depends on. Number 1. Greenville, North Carolina. Not to be confused with its larger, more prosperous South Carolina namesake, eastern North Carolina's Greenville has always been a quieter, more economically fragile market built around East Carolina University rather than a booming tech corridor. Save the one city where the real story actually matches the dramatic framing for last. Greenville was the only North Carolina metro to post an outright price decline in recent regional data, down 3.4% year over year, while every other major metro in the state, from Rocky Mount's 11.3% gain to Durham-Chapel Hill's modest 1.6%, posted appreciation. The poverty rate here does run meaningfully above the state and national average. And without the Research Triangle's tech sector wages to lean on, Greenville's economy depends heavily on East Carolina University and its hospital system to anchor local demand. Here's the final pattern interrupt, and it's the most important one on this whole trip. Out of 10 Carolina cities picked specifically because they were flagged as crash risks, Greenville is the only one where the regional data actually confirms a genuine singular decline, which says less about Greenville being uniquely troubled and more about how rare an actual price decline is across the rest of this list. Even here, the decline is a documented 3.4%, not the double-digit collapse language typically attached to Greenville in more sensational retellings. East Carolina University's continued enrollment and the regional hospital system's steady employment base give Greenville a demand floor that keeps this from resembling the kind of investor-driven ghost town scenario a more dramatic script might reach for, even as it remains, by the numbers, the one city on this list genuinely worth watching closely. So here's the honest version of the Carolinas story in 2026. Both states are described by their own realtor associations as stabilizing, not collapsing. Columbia, Spartanburg, Winston-Salem, and Greensboro are all showing real appreciation, several of them above the national average. Charlotte and Raleigh, the two most hyped bubble markets, are both still projected for price growth even as their inventory rises. Charleston has stabilized rather than cracked. Myrtle Beach's contradictory numbers reflect a market split between condos and single-family homes, not a single uniform collapse. Greenville stands alone as the one genuine outlier with a real, documented decline. The actual lesson from this road trip isn't that the Carolinas are crashing, it's that rising inventory and longer days on market, the two metrics driving almost every claim in the original story, are just as often signs of a market returning to balance as they are signs of one falling apart, and the difference is something you can only see by checking whether prices are actually falling alongside them. 9 times out of 10 on this list, they weren't. If you're weighing a move to any of these 10 cities, the practical takeaway is almost the opposite of the warning this trip set out with. Rising inventory across nearly every stop means more selection and more negotiating room than buyers have had in years, in markets where prices, in most cases, are still moving up, not down. That's not a reason to rush in recklessly, but it's also not a reason to stay away out of fear of a collapse. The actual 2026 data most